Hidden in medieval churches all across the UK, a mysterious figure stares down from roof bosses, from doorways, even from the pews. You may have heard of him, maybe even caught sight of him before. He is known as the Green Man, a figure intimately tied to nature, with the features of a human and the sprouting leaves of a tree in summer. This architectural motif, known as a foliate head, can be found across Western Europe, but with particular concentration in Britain. If you take a cursory glance around the internet, then you'll read that the Green Man is an ancient pagan god, a symbol of fertility and rebirth. But is that actually true? And if so, then why is he such a popular decorative motif in medieval churches? Today, we are diving into the story of the Green Man, his origins, his diverse representations, and the woman who eventually named him. I'm Nicole Miras, and this is Fireside Fables. To me, the month of May is the month of the Green Man. If you live in the Northern Hemisphere, everything now is just so insanely green. I was going to have green tea today because I was doing a Green Man episode, but I was in the mood for breakfast tea, so that's what I'm having. It's pouring rain outside, and for some reason, to me, black tea equals thunderstorm. By the way, if you love folklore or you enjoy learning about strange events from history, then you 100% should be subscribed to Fireside Fables. Liking and subscribing helps me to find more curious people like you. Okay, so where does the Green Man come from? This is the big question. I also thought about wearing green today, and then I forgot. Well, the first thing you need to know is that the use of the term Green Man to describe foliate heads didn't come about until the 20th century. And we're definitely going to get into how that came about. But foliate heads, of course, go back centuries. Here we are defining foliate heads as decorative carvings of heads with leaves sprouting out of their mouths, or with faces that are made either partially or entirely of leaves. In some cases, it's an otherwise normal human face, but with a beard made of leaves. There are some early examples of foliate heads that can be found in the ancient world. For example, this 2nd century sculpture in the ancient city of Hatra in modern-day Iraq, or this 6th century Byzantine mosaic. As far as we know, these examples were decorative, possibly symbolic of fertility or nature's vitality, though likely not representative of specific deities or supernatural figures. You will also find some foliate heads in Roman art. But again, these were not one unified deity, but rather a decorative motif used to represent different figures. The most famous has to be the Great Plate of Bacchus. This beautiful silver plate found with the Mildenhall treasure. The Mildenhall treasure was a hoard of 34 fine silver pieces from Roman Britain, which date to the 4th century and were discovered in 1942 in Mildenhall, Suffolk. The center figure is surrounded by oceanic imagery, including sea nymphs and shells, and a wider circle of Bacchic revels from which the plate gets its name. Though the plate is associated with Bacchus, the central figure is usually identified as the god Oceanus, with a beard made of seaweed and dolphins emerging from his head. There's always the question of whether these foliate heads might be more common than we think, because of course we're working with the material evidence that has survived. One argument made by the historian Ronald Hutton is that foliate heads can be traced to Indian art. Specifically, images of Kirtimukha, a monstrous lion motif who sometimes guards Hindu temples and sometimes is depicted with leaves sprouting from its face. There were certainly trade routes between India and the Mediterranean civilizations, so it's possible that this inspiration may have been traveling alongside the goods that they were trading. That being said, we don't know if this was an instance of direct inspiration or if these cultures were developing this imagery separately from one another. Foliate heads found new life in medieval France, where they began appearing in manuscript illustrations in the 10th century. The visual motif then grew especially popular in churches. In Romanesque and Gothic architecture, foliate heads were used to decorate roof bosses, which are the keystones at the intersection of ribbed vaults. as well as the top of columns or capitals, doorways, portals, pews, you name it. The use of this decorative motif in churches came to England via the Norman conquest, long after the Normans and the Anglo-Saxon communities in Britain had converted to Christianity. Foliate heads really took off as a trend in British churches, and you can find them all across the UK today. However, these figures were not called green men. So were they pagan or were they Christian? As I've noted already, there was no god called the Green Man. Even in the pagan world, there wasn't one figure being depicted with this motif. I think it's tough to argue that these are entirely separate, given the long history of this motif being used in art, including all the way back in the ancient world. But lingering influence is not the same as a hidden or covert surviving mythological figure. Most historians now reject that idea. But if that's true, then as far as the artists are concerned, the people who made these churches, what were they trying to represent? Well, once again, we are in the muddy waters of folklore because the foliate heads didn't necessarily represent one thing. They could be used for a variety of symbolic messages. Rebirth and resurrection being consistent themes in Christian art, as well as the conflict between the untamed wilderness and the sanctity of the church and order in human institutions. In some cases, they could have been merely decorative. Keep in mind that medieval churches are full of weird-looking creatures. Grotesque figures were common in Gothic architecture. These were contorted, fantastical figures, often meant to be humorous. But if medieval artists and architects did not refer to foliate heads as green men, then where does the term come from? In England, during the 16th and 17th centuries, there were indeed green men. Costumed entertainers who participated in pageants, especially the Lord Mayor's pageant in London. Leaves were sewn into their costumes, and they were often described as using torches to clear the path for the procession behind them. The earliest written reference to this kind of green man comes from George Whetstone's 1578 play, the second part of the famous history of Promos and Cassandra, in which the character Phalanx has a brief encounter with two men who are dressed like green men at the mayor's feast, with clubs of firework. While it's unclear exactly when the earliest green men began performing in pageants, the scene's lack of expository details suggests that the audience might have already been familiar with this figure. They continue to be featured in pageants throughout the 15 and 1600s as whifflers, or attendants who cleared the way for the procession. By the 1600s, we also have accounts of the green man being used as a logo on signs for inns, taverns, and distilleries, such as this description from the writer and antiquarian John Bagford. They are called woodmen or wild men, though at this day we in Ye Sign call them green men, covered in green boughs, and are used for signs by stiflers of strong waters and a fit emblem for those that use that intoxicating liquor which berefs them of their senses. We've touched on the concept of wild men before on the show. These were folkloric beings, also called woodwoses, humanoids who lived in the woods separate from society. They were men without God and civilization. So this, coupled with the use of the green man as a whiffler at rowdy pageants, it makes sense why that would be a fitting emblem for a distillery or a tavern. The historian Brandon Centerwall notes a possible connection between the green man of pageants and the foliate heads found in churches. In the Church of the Holy Ghost in Crocombe, Somerset, a bench end carved in 1534 shows both a foliate head and rowdy, club-wielding figures that do resemble the whifflers of pageants. There are other examples of what Centerwall calls combatant green men in other churches. So it does prompt the question if there was some mutual inspiration happening, or if whifflers derived their inspiration from foliate heads in a relationship that went entirely one way, or if these developed entirely separately. Again, murky waters of folklore. We don't know. It was in March of 1939 that the amateur folklorist Julia Somerset, Lady Raglan, published an article in the journal Folklore called The Green Man in Church Architecture. When I say that she was an amateur folklorist, I should note that in the 19th and early 20th centuries, folklore studies hadn't yet been formalized in an academic context. Although given the nature of folklore, I don't think you necessarily need to have a PhD to call yourself a folklorist, although in her case, she only published one article. Anyway, at this time, you had a lot of dependence on local societies and salons. And it was out of this period that you get the pagan survivals theory, the idea that ancient deities and rituals were secretly preserved in Christian rituals and practices. As romantic as that might sound, we know today that the truth is far more complicated. The pagan survivals theory is also how you get some explicitly false ideas, like Margaret Murray's witch cult theory that the witch trials were a systematic attempt to root out secret pagan fertility cults that had supposedly been thriving in the shadows, which is just not true. Anyway, Lady Raglan took the name of the Green Man, which could still be found on pubs and inns across the UK, and applied it to foliate heads in churches, though she did not make the connection to the green men of pageants or processions. Her theory was that these images could be traced back to pre-Christian imagery of one unified figure, whose image lingers in the present as the Green Man. To be clear, she was not arguing that the Green Man was being worshipped by medieval people in secret. But her theory of a unified, continuous Green Man tradition rooted in pagan survivals is no longer accepted by most scholars. Despite this, the name stuck. And to this day, people refer to foliate heads as the Green Man. The image of the Green Man has found new life in the present day as an emblem for environmental activism, as well as a symbol of the UK's ancient past, even if Lady Raglan's theory has largely been disproven. For example, on the invitations for King Charles III's coronation, you'll see the Green Man on the bottom. Here's what I find really special about this. The Green Man is the perfect example of how folklore evolves over time. We know that the Green Man did not have his origins in one ancient forest god, but today he kind of embodies that idea anyway. In the 21st century, as we reckon with the destruction of natural ecosystems all around the world, the Green Man carries new resonance. Individual foliate heads, once largely decorative, are now imbued with new meaning. In a sense, Lady Raglan had it backwards. Rather than one figure, inspiring many throughout history, what you actually have are a variety of figures, works of art, and symbols who have now converged behind one name. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and maybe even share it with a friend or two. Be well, and I'll see you next time.